Hello and welcome to Roll for Topic, an RPG podcast. This is a podcast where we have GMs discussing various topics relating to running games. Let's do some quick introductions. My name is Chris Salzman.
My name is Andy Rao.
Yep, and we are two GMs. We've known each other for a while, but we decided to do this podcast sort of to get a chance to sit down and talk more specifically about one topic relating to, hey, you're the GM. How do you keep this thing going smoothly? So to that end, we have created a D10 table with a number of topics on it, and this is sort of our hook here. Is that every time we record, we pull up that table. We're going to roll a D10, see what comes up, and then we'll use that as our topic. This helps us to sort of not over prep, which is a good thing when you're dealing with GMs.
All right, Chris, I'm going to need a D10 roll from you, please.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Plus, no modifiers.
Yeah. All right, that is a 9. So what's 9 on our table?
All right, let me consult our table here, Chris. Today, our topic, with your result of 9, we will be discussing how you fit a game into 2 hours.
Ooh, okay. Should we keep it narrow to 2 hours, or should this be like how do you fit a game in 1 hour, 2 hours, 4 hours, etc.?
Yeah, let's give ourselves a little leeway and say, how do you run a really short, tight game?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I have some thoughts, but why don't you dive in first?
This has been one of my big goals as a GM over the last couple of years, and that is getting the game experience down to just a couple hours. And it's entirely because of my life circumstances. Like everybody else, I don't have as much time to game as I did in my youth. Mm-hmm. But the main thing is I'm playing more and more with kids, with my own kids and their friends. Mm-hmm. And I have discovered that over a couple of hours, the game really goes south with kids under the age of 12 or 13. So my daughter is 11. I play with her a fair amount with her friends, and I have just found that if I'm going over 2 hours, I start to lose them, and they start getting silly and things like that. So, and I've also found this, and makes for a much easier pitch for my kind of casual gamer friends who are not super enthused at who can't or aren't enthused about the idea of taking 6 hours on their Friday night, like we used to. We start at 6 p.m. and then people are heading home at like 1:15 in the morning. Yeah. That's not really something I can ask from my adult friends with kids and jobs anymore. So 2 hours is maybe a little too short for adults, but I have been trying to keep the games I play with my casual gamer friends somewhere in like the 3 hour vicinity.
Oh, that's interesting. So you mentioned when you were younger you would do 6-7 hour sessions, stuff like that. I guess now I'm just really curious. Like, what was the longest session you ever played?
Oh, I don't know. The longest session, and I'm reaching way back into the mists of memory that are clouded by nostalgia, and but one of the first times I ever played Dungeons and Dragons, this is mid 80s. I was introduced to Dungeons and Dragons by my cousin who I was visiting for the summer, and he broke out this, have you heard of this thing called Dungeons and Dragons? I had vaguely heard that, it was satanic, and so he had a bunch of modules, and I recall starting playing this on like a Friday afternoon and finishing on like a Sunday evening. And obviously we slept in there, but I'm pretty sure we just played D&D. This is unthinkable to me now. I mean, there's no way I could do this now, but I'm pretty sure we played D&D for like 12 hours a day for 3 days. I never topped that experience. And it was a heck of a jump into the deep end of role-playing, by the way. I
mean, that's probably for your own health. It's good that you haven't done that.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Yeah.
I do have these... occasionally I'll read about people, adult gamers saying like, oh yeah, my friends and I rented a cabin and we went up and we played for 12 or 16 hours a day. And, that sounds really cool, but I also just don't see how I could possibly hack that at this point. Like I have trouble sitting down and doing any one thing for more than an hour and a half or something. Even So I'm even playing a video game I love or something like that. It's hard for me to do that. So
Oh yeah, I can't imagine. I mean, so a couple months ago, I got together with some friends, and they wanted to. I think a couple of them hadn't played D&D before, so we ran through, kind of a pretty basic scenario, which was fun. So I ended up GMing for, it was like 2, 3 or 4 hour sessions in one day. And like I was just wiped out. Like I was a little bit sick anyway, But I mean, there's just once you hit your once you're past 25, you kind of can't do that anymore. I think.
Yeah, for sure.
I just don't have the stamina, and especially once you have kids, it's just like the whole whole concept changes.
I don't know who said this, but I remember reading, and it stuck with me. Some game designer or somebody on a forum somewhere saying that role playing is like 1 hour of fun fit into 4 hours. And what I've found when I am playing in longer games, like at a convention where it's typical for a game to occupy a 4 hour time slot, or occasionally even more, is that you do start, somewhere around hour 4, hour 4.5, you do start to realize how much of your typical game is this filler that's not really that fun. So part of the motivation for getting the game time down is to identify that stuff where nobody's really having fun doing this. It's filler content. It's not really adding anything, and seeing if you can at least tone some of that down, if not strip it out altogether.
Yeah. Are there particular things that you're thinking about?
So the bane of my games, the thing that frustrates me, I've been in groups where shopping ends up being this huge time-consuming thing, and this is not something I've ever really been interested in spending a lot of time in game doing. But obviously other people dig it, and if anybody listening to this loves role-playing out their 2 hours of shopping for swords in Waterdeep or whatever, I mean, more power to you.
Yeah.
But what usually happens, if it's not shopping, it's anything where one player has a bug to do something, like they really want to buy a magical spell while they're here in town, or if you're spending more than 10 or 15 minutes on your one player tangent, it's really starts to drag the whole momentum of the whole game down.
Yeah, usually if something like that starts to happen, I will either just say like I don't care, here, just look through the book and tell me what you bought.
Right, yes. That's where I've come, is like, here, it's on page 43 of the player's handbook, just it just
tell me what you have bought, they have it in stock. Sure.
Exactly, yes.
But sometimes what I'll do is I'll if I can, try to split the party, and then you can kind of bounce back and forth between people, give people some time to think, and then also have a more interesting interaction for other people. But like stuff like that is just, I mean, it can just kill it, or sometimes what I've done is just like take a look in between now and next session, and then tell me.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's and a lot of the stuff you can handle it via email in between sessions. You can handle it. I mean, if you really do want to role play this out, and I can definitely see some. I can definitely think of scenarios where you would want to take a player aside and let them role play out an experience that's important to their character. Just meet an hour before the game and run through that with them, or have lunch with them during the week or something like that.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. Are there other sort of filler things that you've noticed that just when you cut them out, the game doesn't really lose anything?
So the other big momentum killer for games that I've run and have been in is planning. I love listening and giving players the opportunity to plan how they're going to tackle a challenge. So just to come up with something like they need to sneak into a castle that's heavily guarded and has various obstacles they'll have to take into account in getting into the castle. I love hearing players plan how they're going to do it. It's super fun, and it usually. And it's also really beneficial as a GM to hear what they're thinking of and planning. It often gives me ideas of how to run the encounter.
Oh, totally. Yeah, there is absolutely a pack of goblins there. Sure.
Yeah, yes. Exactly. Yes, and you'll learn. They'll point out all the things you hadn't thought about, and then you can pretend that you had thought about them. Yeah. But the downside, I find it's really easy for these planning sessions to go on forever, because, and it's not it's not like the players are doing it wrong or something, but it's hard to know when you've planned enough, and you can't read the GM's mind and know the the level of detail that the GM is expecting from your plan. And so I have often found myself in games where the planning is fun for a while, and then it reaches this tedious point where like maybe two players are going back and forth about some dumb detail that as GM I know doesn't even really matter. And so I mean, I don't want to say that it happens in every game, but that one and the shopping thing are like the two things that immediately pop to mind as when does time get wasted and drawn out in games I'm in.
When do you so if you have like, so say you're trying to hit that 2 hours and you have a group that is just arguing about like, well, should we go in the west door or the east door, and you're like, they're both the same door. Like, right. Yeah, when you have that, are there any things that you do to speed them up?
Oh, so I wish I had an arsenal of good ways to kind of, in the spirit of the game, get players moving.
Yeah.
But usually, honestly, at this point in my life, I'm more inclined to just say, "Hey guys, let's wrap this up. Let's call it good. Yeah. Trust me, whatever you've got in mind is you've thought about it more than I thought. You put more thought into this plan than I put into this whole adventure, so we're all good."
There's something nice about just being very direct and honest. I've done that a couple times. In games where I'm just like, look, you can explore more if you want, but there's nothing else here for you. It's like, right. I did not hide any more secret treasure in this dungeon. Yes. Just yes, we can keep moving.
Yeah, there's that is a. Well, I'll hold that thought and get onto it. But I wanted to say, I mean, there's some certainly unsubtle, but probably better ways to put a little pressure on people to wrap up the planning, and that is just to remind them that hey, it's the hour's getting late, or you hear sirens in the distance, or come up with some just way to reminder. And players being pretty cool will probably understand what you're doing, right?
That's actually a really good way to do it. So another thing that I've done, which I'm not exactly proud of, but is sometimes effective, is just hold up my hand and start counting down from 5.
Oh, interesting.
And then when you get down to 0, then roll on like a wandering monster table, something like that.
Oh, that's scary. That's intimidating.
Or it's just a bluff, right?
Oh, right.
I hope none of my players are listening to this, but I mean, just straight up bluff. But I mean, the thing is, you're right. Like people are just kind of going back and forth on something that doesn't exactly matter, and that can be fun. But I mean, if you're reading the table and you're realizing it's just 2 players and the other 3 are sitting there bored out of their minds, it's not good.
I was going to say something you mentioned called to mind another way that kind of filler time ends up taking up space in your game is I didn't realize until I started having this increased pressure to keep games to a reasonable length how long typical combats drag on beyond the point where there's any question about the outcome. And this is probably true of a lot of kind of action scenes and encounters in general, but it's pretty obvious in combat. There's usually a point in any combat where it's really obvious that the PCs are going to win. Yeah, they're over that kind of that initial period where maybe they're over that initial period of threat, and they've taken out the boss and they're cleaning up the goblin guards or whatever, and it's like that's not usually very exciting to play out. There's no tension in the combat. Why are we even doing it? I think you have to be careful with this because you don't want to. It introduces a kind of a metagame aspect that can kind of kill some immersion if you do it too carelessly. But I have started being a little bit quicker to say, all right, you guys round up the remaining bandits and and we're done with the combat, and trying to move that along once it becomes painfully obvious what's going to happen. Do you run into that situation?
Yeah, every once in a while. So the most recent time, so I have a lunchtime game that I run, and I'll kind of get into that next. But they were chasing like a pack of I think they were just like zombies, down a hallway, something like that. Like the cleric could cast Turn Undead, and all the zombies were running away, and it's just like, okay, you're chasing 4 of them, all of you are together at full health, and you have a bunch of spell slots and stuff. So they eventually. yeah, they got to a wall, and I just said, okay, just everybody roll your roll your attack at the same time, essentially. And then they did that, and then just obviously they all hit. So so combat was done. But I did allow them to still have that roll, just in case it would have mattered. Just in case they all rolled ones or something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that was kind of that was one thing that I experimented with. Yeah, it's like once you get to that point where everybody's sort of surrounding the last enemy like that, just go ahead and have them all roll at the same time. And see what happens rather than roll, wait, next person goes.
That's a good idea. Yeah, I mean, once you reach that point, you can kind of stop this artificial turn-by-turn structure and just let everybody roll.
Yeah, especially when the boss is not intelligent in any way. Except if they're fighting a gigantic skeleton, who you're not going to sit there and reason with it at some point when it gets down low on its HP. It's just well, I mean, yeah, you can just kind of jump to the conclusion. I think that's okay. The way that I run into this kind of 2 hour limit is, so I run a weekly lunchtime game, so at 1 p.m. on Fridays, we get together and play for an hour.
An hour. That's pretty tight. That's really tight.
It's very tight. Yeah. So the way that I describe it is that it ends up being sort of like a TV show at that point. So you very quickly sort of get to some sort of, some sort of conflict, you resolve it, and then set a cliffhanger for the next next session, next episode, whatever you want to call it. But since you're doing that, you really don't have time to, spend a bunch of time debating about kind of what your plan is. Because the session might be a single combat, between the party and enemy, and they might take 10 minutes to kind of decide how they're going to do it, and then it takes 40 minutes to do the actual combat, and then you have 10 minutes of wrap up. And two, since it's on a Friday during the workday, some people are actually just bringing their lunch with them, so you have some of that other stuff going on at the table too. I'd say though, it's really fun, and from a GM's perspective, it does sort of train you and teach you how to look for those cliffhangers and those story beats that are just a little bit more interesting than, okay, well, you enter the next room, you go to the next room, you go to the next room, because you want things to have, have some sort of natural interest. Mm-hmm. And I don't do it right every time, but, I'm getting kind of better at it. I've been doing this for about a year.
Yeah, that makes me think that it's something that you don't really read. I don't really remember reading in, the Dungeon Master's Guide and stuff, is this element of pacing. I don't think most D&D, I mean, generally speaking, I don't think people talk about D&D games in terms of, pacing out the time you're playing. I don't remember reading about this in the DMG or elsewhere, but you really have to think about that you would really have to think about that with a 1 hour lunch session. Because if you have if you just had a dud of a session, everyone just, it's an unsatisfying experience. That's just kind of a wasted time. That's gonna really drag your campaign down. Oh
yeah. I've definitely had some duds of sessions too. It's well, is anyone going to come back next week? I hope they had fun. Yeah.
How do you, besides just practice and get used to it, how do you can't have you can't naturally have a cliffhanger, once every hour in a game without putting some real effort into it. So what can you describe what a typical, hour-long session looks like? Do you design the adventures with this 1 hour thing in mind? Do you keep this in mind while you're plotting out encounters?
Yeah, I keep it in mind whenever we're kind of coming to the table. It's okay, what's it basically comes down to what's the most important thing to happen? It's where are they at? What have they said is sort of their next intention? And then what's the important thing to happen that can drive the story ahead? And you can make a cliffhanger pretty much out of everything. So if they've just finished combat, the next thing that can happen is they enter a room and there's something that they really want to explore, but we're done. So they just again, they're doing the starter set, which I think is designed a little bit better than some other adventures for doing this style of play. One cliffhanger example that I thought was pretty fun was, there's a spectator in one of the rooms in Wayback Cave. So it's an old blasted out blacksmithery. So they open the door. They finally figure out a way to open the door. And inside is this giant floating green ball with a bunch of eye stalks and stuff,
Yeah, let's hear it for the spectator, by the way. That's, beholders are kind of old hat now. But
Yes.
spectators,
Yeah.
that's some good stuff right there. Okay.
Yeah, and it was fun. Yeah. So we ended there with the description of the room, and there's this, green floating thing that, gurgles in your head, hello, or whatever. So for them, like, the people that knew D&D were like, oh my goodness, it's a beholder, because all they got was a description of the eye stalks and, floating green mass. And the other people were like, what is that thing, like that? So when we hit the table then the next week, they knew exactly sort of what they were dealing with.
Interesting.
Yeah, right there. Yeah. So that, so as far as a typical session, right, so once we actually all get there, which is like, it's going to take 5 or 10 minutes for everybody to sort of gather. We do a quick check-in if there's any administrative sort of things like, hey, who isn't here? Who's coming next week? Those sorts of things. We do a quick recap. I've been having them do the recap, which helps them sort of set the stage.
That's a great idea. Yep.
Although I know there's lots of GMs that say like players should never be the one recapping, but whatever.
I think that's a great idea.
Yeah. So they do a quick recap, kind of tell me what they think happened. I can correct them if there's anything that doesn't make sense or whatever, and then we just sort of hit the ground running from there. So if they're in a dungeon, they'll probably get through a couple rooms. If they're fighting a big boss, they might just do that boss. Those sorts of things. I guess what I should say is sort of interesting from a GM perspective, because often if you're sitting down for like a 3 or 4 hour session, you're not really sure where it's going to go. When you have it broken down into 1 hour chunks, you can be reasonably sure sort of what the next couple things are going to do.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So you can almost split up your GM prep into these discrete blocks as well. Because sitting down to, like prepping for a 4 hour session, like you could just spend 30 hours doing that. But if it's a 1 hour session and that they're about to face a spectator, like then you're just going to prep, like what does that thing sound like? What can it do? All those sorts of things.
Yep. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I haven't had the pressure of running in 1 hour chunks, but 2 hours is not too much additional time. And what I found is it really helps when planning for a short session like 2 hours, that you have to design an adventure with where it's not going to be too hard to accelerate the final showdown or whatever. If you are coming up on 2 hours and the players have not made as much progress as you want. I have never in my decades of running games ever had an adventure naturally wrap up early. No matter how simple or short I think I've written an adventure, it always just takes longer. And you think I would learn by now how to accurately budget time, but I haven't. And so it means if there are key items or key pieces of knowledge that the players are going to need to have to successfully complete the adventure, you have to get those out pretty early on, because you just can't you can't count on that they're going to get to the later game content in the time you have. And I'm talking about something where it's kind of important to wrap up the story in one night. If you're going to be meeting next week and can pick up where you left off, this isn't as big a deal. But in like a one-shot or convention one-shot or something like that, you have to I try to make sure that they get the key stuff is available for them pretty early in the adventure, or it's stuff that I can easily like move up if I can see that that time is running short. I have definitely blown it and not been able to wrap up like a short adventure in the time slot allotted, and it's a real downer when you aren't going to be getting together again anytime soon to continue, and you had to quit right before the final showdown or something like that.
Yeah.
So you do have to think, like, just keep in mind, I might have to move to have this end satisfactorily. I might have to move the final stuff up rapidly. Is that going to work geographically? Is that going to work in a plot way? So design your adventure so that you can do that.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I mean, so does it come down to sort of things like where it's like every NPC is going to tell them like, yeah, that watchtower over there is pretty creepy.
Yes, I mean, if you have to get blatant about it, and that's some of the cost of doing this is that sometimes you have to drop a little bit of that immersion and just herd people along. I don't mean in a super restrictive railroady way, but if people who are here to play a 2-hour game also understand that we all need to respect each other's time, and so if I need to start having the NPCs get a little heavy-handed with then so be it.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've all had the experience where you're like, you as the GM, you're sitting there being like, this is so obvious. How do you not understand how to make this connection?
Yes.
Or, yeah, like, why haven't you explored this very obvious path? But, I mean, as a player, sometimes you're just like, you're not interested in that, or otherwise, you just overlooked it, or like, I mean, you just don't have the full picture in your head. So sometimes it's very easy to miss that. Yeah, and then if you're playing a 4-hour session, it can be very easy for the GM to just sit back and like, well, hour 3 they'll pick it up. But if you only have 1 or 2 hours, it's really gotta keep moving.
The way this manifests most frequently in my games is basically redesigning dungeons on the fly to chop out like extraneous side paths and things like that. So if they were going to have 3 different corridors they could go down, but time is short, well, I just take out 2 of them and there's really only one way for them to go. Or I just make sure that whichever corridor they take just goes to the place they need to get to.
Yes. Yeah.
That gets tricky though, because, and I've run into this recently, a well-designed dungeon won't be a linear slog towards the end. And I think it's important to not lose that. I think it's important not to just impose total linearity on it, for instance, a dungeon encounter. But when you have a nonlinear dungeon, it means that players could get lucky or smart and figure it out quickly, or they could turn left way at the beginning and then find themselves just spending huge amounts of time in this extraneous part of the dungeon that's cool, but isn't bringing them any closer to the finale. So so I don't know, I guess it's tough. It's hard to if you design the dungeon too small or too linear, people can plow through it too quickly. If you design it too big, you need to be prepared for the risk that they're going to roam off, and you'll either have to waste a lot of time, or you'll have to redesign it on the fly to channel them where they need to go.
Yeah. I don't know how good you are at maps and cartography and stuff, but I have a really hard time doing that. When I'm looking at a dungeon that's kind of already drawn out, and then also trying to draw it out for them sort of on the table, like I have just the hardest time making adjustments.
Yes, yeah. I on more than one occasion, players have tried to like map out a dungeon.
Yes.
So I just kind of freehand sketch dungeons usually on a whiteboard or a battle map as they're exploring, and I don't pay too much attention to dimensions. And I'll occasionally have had players who do pay attention to like exactly how wide is this room. We'll try to map it, and we'll quickly find out my dungeon is this non-Euclidean nightmare that couldn't possibly exist in the real world. It's like
yeah. Like when you're drawing kind of like squiggly lines to connect to
yes, exactly.
two rooms. Like,
but wait, wasn't the whole audience chamber have to be in between these 2 things? And like,
yes.
So, it's fantasy. Come on.
Yes. Yeah.
A wizard did it.
So it's interesting. So I play in a 7th Sea game, which is a very different kind of style of game than Dungeons and Dragons. But in 7th Sea, at least the way that my GM's running it, like we skip over a lot of the like exploring the dungeon part of it.
Okay.
And the thing that he said that really kind of stuck with me was like, well, you're all heroes. Of course you would make it through the dungeon to the final encounter. We had one session where we, we're in this very creepy, dungeon, but like we just kind of jumped to the final part of it, which was honestly the most interesting part of it. It wouldn't have been all that great had we kind of wandered through a maze slowly, especially in that system, which is just not designed for like these small sort of encounters with stuff. But I mean, it did make me wonder. It's like like what if your players like the dungeon exploration part of it, by all means keep going with that. But if what they really like is the big interesting boss encounters, like why not just give that to them quicker?
That's a great point. It does, it makes you the pressure of time like this, it really makes you think, what is actually fun?
Yes.
What is actually, and not in an objective sense, but what is actually fun for my group?
Yeah.
Maybe they do like the just, foot by foot, tactical maneuvering through the dungeon round by round. Or maybe, they're fine with just, you make it through this dungeon and here you are and here's the cackling boss at the end of it,
So it seems like the conclusion to, how do you fit a game into 2 hours is just to, strip away anything that isn't fun for your party.
Yeah.
Which sort of seems like the obvious thing, but I mean, it is, I think it's very easy to fall back on like, well, I've got to have a shopping part. I've got to have, these NPCs do these things. I've got to have dungeon exploration and a boss fight, for it to be sort of a full session. But I mean, really, when it comes down to it, I think like each session ends up being sort of its own unique thing.
Yeah.
And that's what keeps people coming back to the table over and over is like, oh, like what's going to happen this time? Like, am I even going to roll a die this time? Or are we just going to talk to, the shopkeeper for a couple hours?
I think that's a really important point. But I think also one of the challenges of running shorter games is there is value in some of that downtime, some of that not fun time. You have to be a little careful. If you're just flying from amazing scene to amazing scene, I feel like it might start feeling like when you play like the boss rush mode of a video game
yes.
or something, where you are skipping to the most awesome and amazing fights, but there's other stuff in this game, the slower, less awesome stuff that kind of contributed to the whole experience being a satisfactory one. In a short 1 or 2 hour game session, you might just have to give up some of that, slow, that downtime or that slower, not as exciting stuff, and just accept that as the cost of doing business.
Yes. Yeah. Except that the purity of your game might be compromised a little bit, but that's okay.
Well, we can't have that. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, because people still had fun, and that's kind of the point.
I guess that's it's did you have fun? That's really all that matters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so we should wrap up. This was actually a really interesting conversation. It kind of, as always, went in different directions than I thought it was going to.
Yeah, I love this. Not knowing exactly what we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
And at the beginning of this conversation, I think, how could I possibly talk about this for more than about a minute and a half? And yet here we are. So
here we are. Yeah. Okay. Yep. So yet again, you've been listening to Roll for Topic, an RPG podcast. I'm Chris Salzman.
And I'm Andy Rowe.
Have a good day. Bye.